I just want to talk about the positive movement in Latin America. And Venezuela is such a good example of someone standing up to the United States empire, giving oil to people in Quincy, Massachusetts, and giving free oil, to different countries, and having a tremendous support behind him, Chavez, and yet, and it seems like it was so obvious. I mean, it's obvious to me way before the invasion of Iraq that Iraq was chosen and planned for a long time because it had no weapons of mass destruction. It couldn't fight back. And it had no real support. And it was the best place to invade and to get where the United States wanted to. And you spoke about China, like China just, stands up to the United States, does what it wants. And now Venezuela is having an alliance with China and oil and stuff. And so it's so positive, but at the same time, to me, that seems like the biggest threat to the U.S. empire. And that seems like the kind of thing where they would do a covert assassination. I'm sorry to say that, but I just wonder if you feel like that.
Good. I mean, this is a very great threat, and the U.S. is not overlooking it. As I mentioned, the two traditional tools of control are weakening: violence and economic strangulation. Kick out the IMF, weaken a tool of economic strangulation. Military coups, they can't carry off the way they used to. They tried in 2002, described, didn't work. 1963 and 64, they did it in Brazil. It wasn't that different. And then in many other countries, Pinochet is one example. But it's not that the empire is giving up. The U.S. is sharply increasing its military aid in Latin America, South America. The number of Latin American officers being trained has gone up, I don't remember the figures offhand, I think by like 50% in the last couple of years. There are now the U.S. military aid to Latin America, called aid, I hate to use the word, but that's what it's called, is higher than aid from major economic agencies. In fact, the military personnel is higher than key federal agencies. That was never true during the Cold War. And furthermore, the military doctrines are being reshaped. They're now, military officers in Latin America are now being trained to deal with radical populism. Anyone who knows the history knows what that means. It's like murdering priests and union leaders and so on. That's what they're being, and I don't know if, I wouldn't be surprised if there are efforts at assassination, but it's also possible and not unlikely that there are going to be attempts at secessionist movements. I mean, if you say Venezuela, the opposition candidate is from a province, which happens to be one of the few provinces that's anti-Chavez, and is right on the Colombian border. Colombia, the U.S. has a military presence, and happens to be one of the richest oil-producing parts. And there is constant talk about a liberation movement or something, which then the U.S. could move in to defend from the dictator Chavez. I wouldn't be surprised if plans like that are in the offing. And same in Bolivia. In Bolivia, the major gas resources are in eastern Bolivia, which is mainly white and European and pretty rich, and hates the mass of the population who are Indian and what they call black and so on. It's near Paraguay, where the United States also has a military presence, and it's conceivable that there's also been talk about a secessionist movement there. And you can imagine the propaganda, you can practically write it. The brave people of eastern Bolivia are protecting themselves from the dictator. We have to move in and defend them and so on. So that's conceivable. It's even conceivable in Iran. Conceivable. I mean, if you take a look at the geography, the oil is mostly around the Gulf, and the region the Iranian region right near the Gulf happens to be Arab, not Persian. And Khuzestan, the region's called, and I'm sure there's Pentagon planners thinking about the possibility of a secessionist movement that the U.S. could move in to defend. One of the reasons for sending more troops to Iraq would be you'd have the troops on hand if you needed them. I can't read their minds, but if they're not doing their job properly, if they're not thinking about this, so it could happen. But in Latin America, it's a lot harder than it was. There just have been significant shifts towards independence, towards integration, towards there are mass popular movements. The Indian movements are substantial, and remember, that's a huge population. And hard to know where things will go. But for the U.S., it has been extremely important to control Latin America. It goes back to the 19th century. Many of the major U.S. fortunes were made by exploiting resources in Latin America. And as I said, it's not just resources, markets, and investment. It's also an ideological point. If you can't control Latin America, how are we going to control the rest of the world? So it's not going to be simple.